It was supposed to be an ordinary night, but inside a small Minnesota apartment, a tragedy unfolded, one that would leave friends, family, and investigators asking the same haunting question: what really happened between Matthew Ecker and Alex Pennig? Alex Pennig was young, bright, and full of dreams. To those who knew her, she was kind-hearted, quick to smile, and had a way of making everyone feel welcome. She was in a relationship with Matthew Ecker, a man whose life seemed steady on the outside, but inside their relationship, things were far more complicated. On that fateful night, police were called to Alex's apartment. What they found would set off a chain of questions that remained deeply unsettling. After leading officers to the apartment, Matthew Ecker sat down in the hallway. Witnesses say he looked shaken, his face pale, his hands restless. Officer Justina Hser approached him gently, asking what had happened.
Yes, sir.
The first time we met is in Matthew?
No.
And what's your last name?
Their conversation, which lasted almost an hour, was recorded on her body camera. It would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in this case. Ecker explained that everything had been fine between him and Alex. He insisted they had not been fighting, that there was no argument. According to him, Alex had suddenly grabbed his gun from his backpack, walked into the bathroom, and locked the door. Moments later, Ecker claimed he heard a gunshot. Panic set in. He said he forced open the bathroom door, only to discover Alex on the floor, lifeless, with a wound to her left temple. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Investigators struggled to understand, why would Alex suddenly take the gun? Why lock herself in the bathroom? And if this was truly an act of despair, why hadn't there been any warning signs? Friends of Alex were stunned. They described her as hopeful, full of life, someone who had plans for the future. Suicide, they said, didn't make sense. Detectives began to examine the scene more closely, the position of the gun, the angle of the wound, the details of Ecker's story. Some things didn't quite add up. If Alex had taken the gun herself, how had she managed to grab it so quickly without Ecker trying to stop her? Why hadn't he called for help right away? And why did his story seem almost too polished? The body camera footage also raised questions. For nearly an hour, Ecker calmly repeated his version of events, that there was no fight, that Alex had locked herself in, that the shot was self-inflicted. But investigators knew that sometimes, in cases like these, the truth hides in the small details. For Alex's loved ones, the news was devastating. The idea that she would take her own life was unbearable. They pushed for answers, demanding that police dig deeper. And dig deeper they did. Over the months that followed, the case became more complex. Experts reviewed the evidence, legal teams argued over what it showed, and Ecker's own words came under intense scrutiny. Eventually, Matthew Ecker was charged, not with being a witness to tragedy, but with second-degree murder. Prosecutors believe the evidence painted a different picture from the one he told Officer Hser in that hallway. To them, this wasn't a case of sudden despair. It was a crime, a young woman's life cut short. On December 19th, 2022, the charges were made official. Ecker would stand trial. The trial began on February 8th, 2024. For 8 long days, jurors listened to testimony, studied evidence, and tried to piece together the final moments of Alex's life. Then, on February 16th, 2024, the verdict came in. Matthew Ecker was found guilty of second-degree murder. For Alex's family, it was a moment of justice, but not closure. Nothing could bring her back, for it was the end of a carefully constructed story, one that he had repeated again and again, but one that ultimately collapsed under the weight of evidence. Today, the case of Alex Pennig is remembered as a painful reminder of how quickly a relationship can turn deadly. What began as love ended in tragedy, leaving a community scarred and a family forever broken. And for those who study true crime, it remains an example of how words can deceive, but evidence rarely lies. Behind every headline, there's a story. Behind every case, there's a person, and behind every tragedy like this one, there are questions that may never fully be answered.